Hi, welcome back to another lecture on issues in cultural anthropology as we near the end of the semester. This is a review of language and culture. So one of the important things to remember is that anthropological linguistics is different than linguistics in so much as it looks at issues of the intersect of language and culture in a much more detailed way. So let's get started in looking at how culture influences language. And you can see in this slide, I'm going to be talking to the work of Evans Pritchard in 1940 and his study or ethnography of the Nuer, which is a group of people that were fundamentally an East African pastoral society in southern Sudan. Now, he was very clear in his study that they had hundreds of words to describe cows, their horns, their colors, etc. And cattle were an essential component of Nuer life. They provided food in the form of blood and milk, and they were actually a currency for bride price. So his argument is that the knowledge of the rich vocabulary relating to cattle was because cattle were so central to describing and promoting Nuer culture. So here we see that culture influences language. The cows promoted a tremendous vocabulary, and this culture surrounding the cow was central to that very language. Now, culture then also can influence language. Now, the influence of language on culture doesn't stop. What we have here is a couple of debates, and one of which is how culture again influences language. In U.S. sports, as in going back here to the other slide, you can see the reference to the importance in a culture. So look at our culture. Let's just take one example, the value of sports to our society. And you can see that there's language that actually emerges out of the concept of a sport. She threw me a curve. There are many sport analogies that we use or metaphors. She scored a touchdown, and this could be in reference to any number of things in the business world or personal life, right? Somebody could say, I was successful and I hit a home run. Not literally, but figuratively, and all of this cultural material influences the language. Now, we have the idea of language influencing culture. We see here that there can be a very strong influence as proposed by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And Sapir-Whorf were basically saying that their hypothesis argues that perceptions and understanding of time, space, and matter are conditioned by the structure of language. And you can see from the slide here that this would make them language determinists, believing that language actually determines culture. They made a very strong argument for this, believing that language had a compelling influence on thought. And in fact, Sapir wrote in 1949, this is a quote from him, that human beings do not live in an objective world alone, but are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. The fact is that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. Well, there you have it. This is called a linguistic determinism. Now, where did this come from? After studying the language of the Hopi Indians, Benjamin Whorf developed an idea that a language forces the native speakers to perceive the world differently. Whorf then went on to work with the linguist Edward Sapir, and together is when they came up with this hypothesis. It states that language constructs our perception of reality. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, actually weighed in on this, said it a little differently. He said that the limits of language define the limits of one's world. This has been debated for a long time, this argument, but in the end, people believe it's a little too strict in its understanding of how language influences culture. So let's move on to talk about how language mirrors our social reality and our values. I think one way you can start to study a culture is through its metaphors. Now you can see here I reference a book that came out in the 1980s and made quite a splash within the linguistic community. This book by Lakoff and Johnson, Metaphors We Live By. This book potentially suggested, well, it did suggest that metaphor is a characteristic of language, and it is a rhetorical matter of words rather than the thought of action that help us describe our social reality. They're arguing it is a way of drawing standards for comparison and a way to conceptualize what we are trying to convey. So metaphors are used in our language more than people think. So there are some very obvious metaphors, but what about the ones that are so subtle we don't even recognize them as metaphors? So you could see this one that I give as an example, time is money. This is very much an easy one, but it also is an inroad into understanding American life. You reverse this with the is as an equal sign. You could say money is time. People also operate like that. And this will give you could unpack, to use the jargon, this three-word equation and do a cultural study of the relationship of time and money in American life. It would be very, very in-depth as to how this simple statement defines American life. But we could talk about metaphors in very different ways. For example, we are very much, indeed, we are looking at time and money in many, many different ways. But Here, let me give you an example. And because of time, we have a very important value here. And so look at the expressions that we use every day. You're wasting my time. I don't have time to spare. Um, that flat tire cost me an hour. You get the point where we're going here? Um, should I go to medical school? Is it worth my while? Right? You see, worth my while, right? Relationship of time and money. Someone in a very bad situation. He is living on borrowed time. And how about an admonition that one might hear? Uh, you don't use your time. Oh, this one is wonderful. Profitably. Okay. So this again, this is reflected in our culture because we have wages based on hours, interest that grows over time, yearly budgets, etc. So time and money are intricately attached. But we also use war metaphors, going back to that. And we could say things like, he attacked every weak point in her argument. Got a question? Okay, comma, shoot. I won the argument. I demolished his argument. And certainly everything about disease is in terms of war. We have ideas here about war is ugly, and so is disease. She beat her flu. All types of metaphors of attacking and demolishing the disease process. But another concept of metaphor that gives us an insight into our social reality is an orientation metaphor. So unlike structural metaphors that I've been talking to you about, orientational metaphor gives a whole system of concepts with respect to one another. These metaphors have something to do with special orientation, up, down, in and out, on and off. So, happy is up. That boosted my spirits. Sad is down. He is feeling low. Health, life are up. He's in the peak of health. Sickness and death are down. He came down with the flu. Do you see where this is going? And high status, for example. She rose to the top, low status. He's at the bottom of the hierarchy at work. So here we have the very premise of how language mirrors our social reality and can be an excellent way into an investigation of a particular society. I highly recommend this book as they explore other ways that metaphor can be used, personification, ontological as well. So you get the idea that metaphor is a very powerful way in. So sociolinguistics. Now this is very commonly associated with both anthropology and sociology and other fields as they try to understand how language and the social structure interact. Now, one of the things that I would suggest to you here is that people have been very careful about how they have discussed this, but because you don't want to make too much of something and an overgeneralization. But this allows us to understand language and social structure in a very interesting way. Consider language as a class marker, and that's the upper and lower language idea. You might find this particularly prevalent if you wanted to look at, for example, British society. You could go to England and you could look at the Oxbridge accent and what that would imply in terms of one's social standing versus the Cockney accent and what people take away from that. Um, so you get some class markers. For example, social standing can be implied by more standard forms of pronunciation. And again, people generally, particularly in America, find this to be maybe a little too stringent, and they will talk about these grammar uh, um, hawks and people who are too hung up on a specific type of standardization of American English, and not allowing for subcultural, um, what you might say, enhancement. Okay. So, for example, I would argue to you, and we are in a presidential election year. Listen to the way the political class talks at rallies and where they are. So everything from rolling up the shirt sleeves to wearing some sort of flannel shirt to their language might change if they're talking to a population that they believe might be of a working class. Okay, so now one of the things that you will hear in many speeches is the dropping of the ing ending. So instead of saying running, someone will just drop that. Running. I'm running. I'm not running, um, which is a way of saying I have a lot in common with you. All right, so moving on, we have a couple of non-verbal language concepts to go over quickly, and they include proxemics, which is really about the social space that people have across cultures. In the United States, we tend to be within a 3-foot sphere of others. You could extend your arm, and that's really the social space of comfort. And so this territoriality is what one might call the personal space. Now, another space, and these are limits defined by this gentleman, Edward Hall. He also talked about intimate and social and public space. And he talked about 16 to 18 inches in an intimate space with a much lower voice. I just described to you the personal hyphen social space. Um, but in general, things change as you move across cultures. You might get other cultures where people close very much into the American circle of 3 feet, and come right on you to even touch you in their conversation with you. Culture time. One of the questions one might ask yourself is, how long would you wait for an appointment, let's just say, with a professor? How long would you wait? Um, Most people would say that if you have an appointment at 3 and someone is not showing up by 3:15, 3:20, you could pretty well leave and be justified that you waited it out. So we have about a 15-minute grace. Um, okay. Now, in ideally in American time, we probably work around a 5-minute grace period, which would be acceptable. But beyond that, then the person is really late. Um, So, you know, at the 15-minute point, you show up, it requires an apology. Um, Now, you go somewhere else in other parts of the world. Let's just, I don't want to overgeneralize. Let's just go to Saudi Arabia, for example. Um, in business terms, 45 minutes would be the latitude. So no one would be upset with a 45-minute um, give or take from the appointed hour. If the hour was at 3 and someone showed up at 3:15, 3:20, 3:30, nobody would offer an apology. Finally, silence. There are social hierarchies in silence studies, and when individuals of unequal social standing interact, it seems that higher ranking individuals talk more than the lower status individuals. And this uh, came from a work on language and culture. All right, so um, what we conclude with here is a very short video about language connection, and you can see at the individual level. So thank you for your attention, and I appreciate your time.